Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Governor State University. My name is Maureen Kelly. I'm the Director of Government and Community Relations here at the university. And on behalf of President Elaine Maiman, we welcome you and thank you for joining us. Unfortunately, due to the Jewish holiday, she was not able to attend this evening, but does send her warm regards. So I'm sure we're going to be in for a very enlightening panel discussion this evening. Real quick, I wanted to mention a campaign that we're in the midst of right now. As you see my GSU vote button, as part of our commitment to civic engagement, we have been encouraging our faculty, students, and staff to register to vote and show up at the polls on Election Day and exercise their civic duty. So I'm happy to report with the strong support and assistance of our Student Senate and a campaign that goes on actually until tomorrow, I believe. They have registered well over 200 voters right here on campus. So I applaud the Student Senate, and it was a great job on their part. We really encourage everybody to be registered, to come out and vote, and if you don't vote, you don't have a right to complain. So no matter what your position is, you really need to get out there. And so this is a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about the process, and hopefully you'll all come out and vote on November 6th. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Krause, and we'll get started with our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, and thank you to everyone for being here. What we're going to be doing here this evening is each panelist will be talking a little bit about their particular topic on gender and women in political discourse. And then we're going to open it up to the floor for discussion and dialogue, and you'll be able to come up. You'll notice there's a microphone over here in the stands where you'll be able to ask questions and find out anything you're interested in. So I'd like to introduce our panelists first. We have Deborah James from the Communications Program. We have Dr. Culverson from the Political Science. We have former Congresswoman and State Senator Deborah Halverson, and we have Professor Tamara Wynn from the Interdisciplinary Studies Program. So if you could give them a nice round of applause. We'll begin now with Senator Halverson.
Good evening. It's great to be back at GSU, my alma mater, where I got my bachelor's and my master's degree. So thank you all for having me back, and thank you so much, professors, for having me. You know, this is a topic that I could probably talk all day on. Political discourse, women, gender in the political world. Having served in the state senate and in Congress as a female, I think that you'll probably have a lot of questions, and hopefully I can answer them. I just want to start out by giving you a little background and maybe a few statistics, maybe something just to get you started thinking as we talk about what we're going to do with regards to how to move forward in changing the way that things happen in the world. Maybe you know, maybe you don't, that women hold only 16% of the spots in Congress. 16. In fact, when I lost in 2010, first time since the 1970s that we had fewer women in Congress. We had been making gains every year, but in 2010, 10 out of the 11 women elected lost. Only one survived. Now I'm talking about the Democrat. There were a few Republicans that won. But out of the 11 Democrats who were elected in 2008, 10 lost. Now, some say that it was a backlash on Speaker Pelosi. Some just say that people didn't even think about it. But some say that they just didn't vote for the women. So we're going to have to talk about that. But I want to talk about an article here to give somebody something, some other things to think about. When women are in elected office, they get a lot more done. Statistics prove that when a woman is in office, she works at a different pace. And I can tell you that it was true in my case. I was elected to the state Senate in 1996. I worked at a different pace because I had to prove myself. Most people saw me and they said, this is a fluke. She'll be in and she'll be out. I was in my 30s. I would go to receptions to sign up and they would say, which senator are you here to represent? And I say, I am the senator. And they would roll their eyes. I would come in early in the morning because I knew if I was going to make it in this world, I better know what I'm talking about. And I think as women, we know and realize that we better know what we're talking about. And if we open our mouth, we better have something to say. So I'm not going to take up much more of the time here because I want to talk and answer more of your questions. I want to know what it is you want to talk about, because there is a lot that we can discuss with regards to this. So I'm going to, sit by and answer your questions because, again, there's a lot that we need to talk about with regards to gender and women and political discourse. Thank you.
James will be next.
Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you to my panel, and thank you for our special guest, Debbie Halverson. This is really quite wonderful to have this opportunity. I just want to create a link between what Ms. Halverson was saying about what it takes to be in politics and what it takes for a woman to be in politics. And I think it's just as important that we ensure that there's women in all areas of politics. So not only do we need women in politics in elected office, but we need more women in media who are talking effectively about the political process. And I agree, we need to ensure as women that when we talk, when we speak, that our words are backed up with evidence and that we frame the questions that are useful to the people who are listening to us. So today I'm going to be talking about the political discourse of Rachel Maddow. Now, Rachel Maddow is a political commentator for MSNBC. She has a nightly show. And I want to speak to her in the context of what I see as a gender gap in political discourse, and particularly in effective broadcast news media. With my background in media, I'm particularly interested in and how these things sort of get divided up and who actually gets to cover what issues. And I'm also interested in how that intersects with the role of a free press and how it is designed to help us, the people, make informed decisions. And here we are in our under a month to Election Day. So, I was looking for a framing statement. So I went on the current state of political discourse, and here I quote Andrew Rosenthal of the New York Times, who says that political discourse is at rock bottom. So, in response to that, I decided to reframe my question a little bit to ask, what function do women play in political discourse, specifically within the mainstream media? And to address this question today, I focus on Rachel Maddow, and particularly the way she discussed politics in her show. Now, she has a top-rated MSNBC show. She is an Oxford graduate in political science. And during the 2008 election, she made a name for herself because she is smart, because she is witty, and because she debates her opponents with civility, humor, and persistence. Time magazine describes her particular mix of nice and smart, and I quote, the new nasty in political punditry. She's won numerous awards, including an Emmy Award for the Outstanding News Discussion and Analysis category. She has won a Gracie Award presented to her by the American Women in Radio and Television. She has won an award from the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Media Defamation Media Awards and the Walter Cronkite Faith and Freedom Award. She is no lightweight. So, in terms of my method, what I decided to do, I was going to focus very narrowly on one particular show. I chose Friday, September 21st. I chose her show. She focused on two big topics. Her topics was the secret Romney video and also the tax return for 2011. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the content as much as I'm going to be talking about her particular approach to these two issues. So, depending on where you are in terms of how you look at these particular issues, you may be interested in this from an entertainment perspective, because heavens knows that's the way it has been presented. But you must also consider that this is potentially a voting issue, and that's really what we're looking at when something is happening with a presidential candidate leading up to an election. So as an engaged citizen, I decided that that is what I would do. Okay, so what we're really talking about in many cases is what is the soundbite? And I use this term to sort of help frame what I'm going to talk about and how Maddow contradicts the soundbite format, is to give you an idea of what a soundbite is. Now, it is a term that is used to describe a specific clip, a sound, a video, and in some cases you can even apply it to new media headlines. It represents, or in some cases takes the place of, a longer story. In its best form, what it does is it leads us to read and go in depth to a story. In its lesser format, however, it promotes a political discourse that lacks in depth and efficacy, and it does not allow for us to define the political question, which is so important as we move closer to an election. And it also leaves us with no space for political discussion. So a soundbite, in essence, can curtail intelligent examination of an issue, and it blurs the lines between an important issue that we need to understand in order to go to the polls, or a combination of political reality TV entertainment, which often is what a lot of some of these gaffes, in particular this 47% secret video, is often portrayed at. So what we're looking at here is how Maddow does a job on, or how she frames herself, how she approaches these particular issues. Now, given her 1-hour format, she decides to create 15-minute and 1.5-minute segments. So in the first 15-minute segment, what she does is she takes this issue and she actually explains it. What is a tax credit? Who is legally allowed to access a tax credit? I realize that this kind of information is not necessarily entertaining, but it certainly is interesting. And in fact, a legal tax credit, we are all entitled to a legal tax credit. Why wouldn't we take advantage of a tax credit? Romney himself is quoted in July as saying that he should be taking full advantage of his tax credits. And in fact, if he did take full and legal advantage of his tax credit, that he would not be a particularly good candidate to run for president. So let's just pin that for a second as we move on to the next section. So what we're doing here is she's asking questions about what a tax credit is. Who are taxpayers? And well, we are all taxpayers who are legally able to take advantage of tax credits. In that video, he made particular disparaging comments about people who actually have taken advantage of the legal tax credits. Very interesting. In contrast, when she's talking about his particular tax return, we see a history of someone who may or may not take advantage of his own tax credits. I think that potentially could be very generous, but in terms of how he's positioning himself, he's indicating that if he did not take full and legal advantage of his own legal rights to tax credits, that he would not be a good candidate. However, when we're talking about how she frames these questions, we're seeing someone who takes full advantage of the Socratic questions approach, which is to not only clarify, but to probe assumptions. So we're looking at questioning the whole entertainment value of these secret videos. What is the evidence? She provides evidence on a regular basis, and she questions viewpoints and perspectives. And perhaps almost just as important is she questions the question. Why would we be interested beyond the scandalousness of a secret video? What is the content of that video, and why is it an issue that he might consider 47% of those who have legal right to take advantage of tax credits to be a concern? Why is that a problem? So, I went to numerous different places and took a look at both so what would be considered sort of liberal media, but I also took a look at conservative media. And there was very little ability or attention to drawing the lines between and connecting the stories between this particular story, this secret video, and the 2011 tax return, and his claim that if he did not take full advantage of his tax credit, that he would not be a proper candidate for presidency. However, what we are seeing in a 1-hour format in terms of what Rachel Maddow does is she actually goes in and draws those connections. She takes advantage of the archival video. She takes advantage of the segments. She interviews people. She looks at tax returns. She looks at all the kinds of different evidence that you might get, and she asks both sides of the election, where are they standing on this? In the second segment, Maddow and her guests then dive into the political and moral aspects of this. So first we're looking at what is the legality of the tax credit and who is involved in that story. In the second section, she approaches the moral and political implications of Romney's rather, frankly, disdainful assertion that these people, the 47%, don't pay or fulfill their responsibility to society. And she points out in the video that Romney is setting for the stage for how he not only perceives paying taxes, but how he potentially is going to participate in the process once if he were to be elected. He is concerned about people not paying their fair share, but mind you, is not particularly inclined to participate in that particular process. So it's a matter of connecting the dots. And that's one of the things that Rachel Maddow does, and what I see is a particular unique approach to political discourse. It takes time, the questions are complicated, it's a serious issue, and it can't be simply blown off as a secret video that was taken under very specific circumstances. So before I leave you, I just want you to think about where does this leave us? We have particular duties and responsibilities as within the civic and the public sphere. It is our responsibility to participate, but it's also our responsibility to pay attention, to understand the questions. We have a relationship, a human relationship actually, with the media, not to mention our elected and soon-to-be elected officials. When we're talking about these particular issues, it is important that not only do we have a relationship with our media, but then we are able to have the information that we need to make a sound decision. And I find in this particular instance, the researched commentary that is provided by Rachel Maddow is not only compelling on the level of promoting collective responsibility of civic engagement, but her approach respects the viewer's intelligence. And at the end of the day, really that's what we want from our media. We want someone who takes us seriously, who provides us with the information that we need in a format that leaves us understanding what we need to know, but then we're there to make our own decisions. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for showing up here. You probably have better things you'd like to do on this nice fall afternoon. Also, I wanted to thank Arness for inviting me to participate in this panel. My remarks this afternoon will focus on two equally disturbing trends that have emerged in recent months from the right wing. The first is the lowering of the bar as to what's acceptable for justifying unequal treatment of women. And the second one is the continued expansion or raising of obstacles for women to become full and participating members of our society. Indeed, it's kind of an interesting aside. One can see some parallels between right-wing efforts to justify unfair treatment of women and that of gangster rappers, in the sense that both of them justify unequal treatment of women by using abusive language, number one, and they both set aside visible spaces for women to perform, but only when they perform in ways that reinforce male privilege. So if you think about the gangster rap video, there's a parallel there. I'll see if I can elaborate on this a little bit more. But certainly, I mean, the idea or the process, the backlash movement against the women's movement has been in motion for more than 4 decades now. And some of us remember the early 1980s, in which the second wave of opposition to the feminist movement led to the defeat of the ratification of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. A recent turning point in the right-wing treatment of women was the 2008 electoral disaster of vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. It was clear that Palin's election was designed to capture the evangelical right wing, as well as growing concerns of women who had been alienated by the Bush-Cheney administration. However, despite the fact that Palin projected herself as a kind of Margaret Thatcher on steroids, I have to pause there for a second because many of the members of our audience are too young to remember who Margaret Thatcher was. And so for those, I'll just clarify. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of England from about 1989 to, I think, 1991 or 92. And for many, she was seen as sort of like the British counterpart to Ronald Reagan. And Margaret Thatcher sort of projected herself as this woman who, unlike Debbie Halverson was saying, who was not just one of the boys, she was one of the boys. I mean, she was more boy than the boys were in many cases. And we won't go any further than that. But the point is that, Sarah Palin, tried to project herself in that mode. She was she liked to hunt. She, was very much the kind of, she played basketball in high school and all that sort of stuff. And she was very much, one of the boys. However, it was clear that Palin was not ready for prime time, or at least not anything beyond the entertainment division. She went through the motions of trying to become a serious presidential candidate, but her quick exit from the political stage to Fox TV, to book writing, to reality shows, and the lecture circuit quickly ended such speculation. And then there were a number of others, I won't go into detail about the candidates, but I just want to talk about of the last election, but I just want to talk a little bit about some of the issues I think that have defined much of what we're talking about today. Opposition to choice, opposition to provision of birth control, things that are important to many women, the use of God to justify opposition to women. Most of us can remember that panel convened by the all-male panel convened last spring on women's health, in which, again, no women were invited to testify, even though it was mostly men testifying. On women's health, let me repeat that. A panel convened by men on women's health, and yet no women were invited to testify. And then a few days later, in the panel convened by the Democratic members of that committee, in which the Georgetown law student Sandra Fluke was testifying. And she was, again, when she was asked to when she wanted to testify in the first panel, she was told that she had no expertise. And then to think about the attacks upon her afterward by certain right-wing radio columnists, shall we say. Among other things we've seen in this last few years, the state of Wisconsin overturned its gender pay equity requirement in their right-wing dominated legislature, overturned gender equity. And just think about the decades that women have spent trying to get equal pay. And the fact that women make, someone correct me on this if I'm wrong, 72 cents for every dollar? Oh, that high. So, and these are still major issues. And let's not forget the governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, who was encouraging this mandatory vaginal ultrasound procedure on women. And then the recent judge in Arizona, Judge Jacqueline Hatch, who overturned the conviction of a man who was been found guilty of sexual assault. And in the process of overturning the verdict, she blamed the victim for she said the victim was responsible for the assault. And I wouldn't say this is the worst because they keep on coming. Missouri Senate candidate Todd Akin, who used the word, and I feel very conflicted even repeating this, legitimate rape. So what we see here is the increasing demonization of women and the increasing rationalization or justifying of this type of language. by people who one would expect to exercise some degree of leadership in the political world. Let me just sort of try to put this into context, I mean, for both from a personal as well as a generational standpoint. Like most people of the baby boom age cohort, I think that we had to adjust to the rapidly changing political and social climate of the 1960s and 70s. However, as far back as I can remember, having two working parents was the norm, especially for African American families who were poised to enjoy middle-class opportunities. College, graduate school, and working from the 70s onward were extensions of the environment of men and women working in ways that challenged patriarchy and gender role expectations of earlier generations. Most of us came to accept gender equality as long overdue. And over time, women's liberation drove deeper into the fabric of our daily lives, and we, men and women, recognized women's liberation as opportunities and assets, and not as threats to our lives. While the institutional setting that I experienced went a long way towards my own acceptance of women's inequality, I cannot overlook other factors that played a role. Like most men of his generations, my father was very traditional in his expression towards gender roles and expressing his attitudes toward gender roles. From his perspective, women took care of the inside of the house and men managed the outside. Yet, the practical realities of day-to-day living challenged those rigidities, and my father responded accordingly. He married a woman he met in college who shared his educational and career goals. When they started a family, my father adjusted to the demands of a two-career household and took on the full range of domestic responsibilities from cooking, cleaning, and childcare. In fact, because my mother had a much longer commute to work than did my father, it was he who prepared breakfast and got the kids ready for school. The point I want to make here is very simple. Although my father defined himself as traditional in gender role expectations, his expectations for himself and his family required alteration of those expectations. And although I came of age in a much more tolerant era, it was easy for me to accept them because I'd experienced those new gender role expectations within my own household. The shared parenting that I've experienced in my own life with my wife and child is a natural extension of what my parents had struggled with. And so I came to realize that indeed I was my father's son. Now, that's something I think all of us have to deal with, the fact that we are our parents' children. Just an interesting, some years ago when my then 5-year-old asked me, he said, "Daddy, why do I have to do what you say?" And as an enlightened parent, I wanted to give him a response that would be consistent with that. And I struggled for a few seconds, and then I said, "Because I said so." And it was one of those painful moments where I was reminded that I indeed was my father's son. Let me just conclude by saying that, just to draw a parallel here. Recently, I started reading a book by the Wall Street Journal columnist Robert Frank. The book is called Richistan, A Journey Through the American Wealth Boom and New Rich. Frank, in this book, looks at the new members of that filthy rich class of people who are far removed from the experiences of most Americans. We may have had some glimpse of them in the political world as well. And he says these people are so far removed from the lives of most Americans that they live in a virtual country unto themselves. They make more money, pay lower taxes, and are able to stash money in places that further conceal their wealth. They live in separate communities, send their children to separate schools, work and play apart from the rest of us. It occurred to me that there are some parallels between the existence of men who advocate these, continued repression of women and these residents of what he refers to as Richistan. And I want to call this place, this new space of opposition to women, as Patriarchistan. And these men who live in Patriarchistan, again, they live in spaces apart from the rest of us. They don't see women as equal partners in all spheres of life. They see them as somehow to be controlled. Women are not to be equal partners, they are to be controlled. They see women as objects, as playing well-defined roles as housewives and mothers with the primary task of reinforcing patriarchy. Sometimes, and some of the women of Patriarchistan work, but only after they fulfill their primary wife-mother obligation. What is abundantly clear is that these women are insulated from the social realities that shape the lives of the vast majority of American women who work and serve as primary caregivers of children, spouses, parents, siblings, and other relatives and friends. In Patriarchistan, women's most significant challenge is finding the right host staff to do all those things. I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to challenge the views, the efforts to impose a kind of Patriarchistan on our society, particularly since we've gained so much as a result of women's liberation and the expansion of freedoms for women. And in closing, I would say men cannot be free unless that freedom is shared with women. Freedom is not a zero-sum gain. Freedom is not a zero-sum gain in which any gain of a woman comes at the expense of men. Women's freedom and independence are not threats to men, but they are assets that all of us benefit from. Thank you very much.
Next will be Professor Nguyen.
Thank you all for coming, and I'd like to say it is an honor to sit on this esteemed panel with my colleagues, and it's very properly arranged because I'd like to expand on the gender perspectives of women in politics. Also take a look at the other countries and how they view women in government and in politics within the society. When we are deciding whether to choose a female candidate, stereotypical perspectives come into play. And often, characteristics that are associated with women decide whether or not we will choose a woman over a man. So, according to the scholars, this posturing may be based on individual attitudes toward women in government, which shape specific choices that voters are faced when they want to or cannot decide whether to elect a female candidate. For example, a voter who values greater representation in women in government may be moved to support a woman in a race against a man. In the cultural matrix, the ideal candidate is masculine, as you've heard from all my panel members, and anything inferior, even if a male has a feminine characteristics, they're considered inferior. So, and they're also feminized. Gender stereotypes about the abilities and traits of political men and women are clear and well documented. But stereotypical perspectives may also serve to shape an individual's evaluations about a woman's place in office. Much of the work on gender studies is about identifying the different types of stereotypes they place on women when they begin to run for office. One hypothesis is that people with more positive stereotypes will be more likely to support a female candidate if she is a Democrat than if she was a Republican. This suggests that voter attitudes and behavior towards women candidates are shaped in part by their party affiliation. People who see more women in government as a benefit to the country do so because they evaluate women more as being conscientious and more likely to exercise fiscal responsibility. A lot of the literature that I reviewed said that women are more responsible with money. There's less corruption when a woman is in a political office, and they also feel more secure about how the funding and the fiscal dollars will be spent over the course of that elected year, which means gender is both social and political, and the presence of cultural symbols is very present. To illustrate this concept, I explored and examined different nations to see what they were doing as opposed to what the United States is doing. And what I found is that each individual country hold their own cultural perspectives on how they view women. And this shapes the attitudes on whether or not they will elect a female candidate in office. Accordingly, the similarities between men and women as human beings get downplayed and the differences stressed and then categorized. While reviewing the cultural climate in these other countries, there were some that stood out more than others. In 1990, the United Nations Development Program created the Gender-Related Development Index, and this evaluated the differences between party affiliations and between what a woman will bring to the table as opposed to what a man will bring to the table. The Nordic countries and the U.S. were in stark contradiction. The Nordic countries make up a region in North Europe and North Atlantic, and this consists of Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, and their associated territories. Nordic policies are more concerned with encouraging women and encouraging the adoption of the Nordic model. The Nordic model seeks to eliminate the inequality between men and women. And the American approach appears to rely more upon protecting the rights of the women and whether or not to violate those rights or uphold those rights of women. In Finland and in Norway, they apply what's called a quota system. And this quota system is also used in Rwanda. Rwanda is located in Central and East Africa. The National Assembly there consists of 80 members, and 24 of those seats are reserved for women. Another 3 seats are reserved for youth and disabled members. The remaining 53 are elected under a proportional representation system. Following the 2008 election, there were 45 female deputies, making Rwanda the only country with a female majority in the national parliament. Rwanda also has low corruption levels relative to most other African countries. They must be doing something right. Rwanda's success represents a world record in terms of the number of women in parliament, and the women lead the way for institutional transformation, legislative reform, and gender equality. However, this can easily lead to tokenism and having a woman on the seat as a token of representation. So it's it's cut and dry there, and you have to be sure that they are there for the substantial information and material and the role that they play within the parliament. The presence, however, the presence of these women were there because of the actions of advocate groups. Anytime you have a woman's advocacy group backing a female candidate, you're more likely to get that candidate elected. Also, the adoption of the quotas for the parliament representation also played a big role in whether the women were elected to that seat. And then also shifting society norms, because the norm in society is that certain characteristics and traits are attributed to women and certain characteristics and traits are attributed to men, as Dr. Colson stressed. The 2 major political parties in the United States, they have a substantial gender different image that they portray to the public. And Americans' images of the politics take on a masculine view. This configuration works to associate masculinity with politics, which may have mapped masculinity and femininity onto the Republican and Democratic parties, respectively. There is a considerable overlap between the political issues that citizens associate with each party. Republicans are thought to handle better issues such as defense, dealing with terrorism, and controlling crime and drugs. And these are precisely the sort of issues that Americans associate with men and masculine traits. Democratic-owned issues include education, health, women's issues, helping the poor, protecting the environment, and promoting peace. These are associated with women and all feminine traits. Today, the 21st century is abundant with a lot of successes, but we still are very disproportionately represented in political parties. The reality is that although there's an underrepresentation in American government, the issues surrounding whether or not a female candidate is elected have a lot to do with the way people view a woman as far as her role and what role she plays. all of the traits and all of the characteristics that Dr. Colson had mentioned, that the woman's job is to take care of the home and do this, these have had decades to set in, and sometimes they're very difficult to remove. Once you know that this is what you've been taught, these are the roles that women play, it's very hard to have them to lead our country, to lead us into a better way of living, to lead us into healthcare, to lead us into education, because this is what we've been taught all of our lives. So the current scholarly research on women's underrepresentation has demonstrated that this situation cannot be explained by poor candidate quality, inadequate campaign resources, or overt voter bias against women. Instead, recent works have highlighted the importance of institutional influences, political party recruitment, and the number of women willing to stand as political candidates. So before we decide whether or not we will choose a man over a woman, we must examine our own perspectives, our own stereotypes, and see if that has any determining factors on whether or not we choose them. Not because of the characteristics that we have always been taught to believe, but who will do the better job? Who will bring to the table what we need in America? And these are the things that we need to take a look at, a strong look at. What do we feel in our hearts? Thank you.
Wow, those were all great, weren't they? Yeah. I'd like to just start by thanking Governor State for allowing us to have this panel discussion this evening. I got started on this in the spring. I was, thinking about women in political discourse, and I was thinking that this was a conversation that needed to be had, and what a better place to have it than in an academic setting. This panel discussion is possible because Governor State awarded us an institutional grant, which we are very grateful for, and thank you for that support. So it was back in March when I was looking at this issue, and one of the reasons that I started looking at this issue was because of the wonderful comments made, and I'm sure you're all familiar with them, by Mr. Limbaugh, regarding a Georgetown Law School student who Dr. Culverson alluded to a little bit earlier, who wanted to speak at a congressional hearing on contraception. All she wanted to do was talk about a friend of hers who needed contraception not for birth control, but rather for cysts. Much to the dismay of most women, Mr. Limbaugh proceeded to say, and I quote, "What does it say about the college co-ed Sandra Fluke, who goes before a congressional committee and essentially says that she must be paid to have sex? What does that make her? It makes her a slut, right? It makes her a prostitute. She wants to be paid to have sex. She's having so much sex, she can't afford the contraception. She wants you and me and the taxpayers to pay her to have sex." Well, this quote led to a great deal of dialogue regarding whether or not the government should include the payment of contraception for women in its healthcare reform efforts. Surely, I thought, this is a unique comment made by an extremist. But this wasn't the case. It appears that the war on women in political rhetoric is in full swing. According to the Voices of Reproductive Choices, an emergency action campaign designed to speak out against current attacks to women's reproductive health and rights, the political discourse is such that there are currently 3 legislative bills that would impose funding or coverage restrictions on critical health services, endanger women's health, limit women's rights as moral decision makers, and erode religious liberty by imposing one view of abortion. So, is there a war on women? It depends on who you ask. Both sides of the political aisle agree that there is a war raging over women, but not necessarily against women. In an interview with Bloomberg Television, Republican National Committee Chairman Renice Priebus dismissed the war on women rhetoric as a concoction of Democrats and their sympathizers in the news media. President Obama's deputy campaign manager, Stephanie Cutter, issued a statement contending that the RNC chairman's comparison of Republican attempts to limit women's access to mammograms, cervical cancer screenings, and contraception to a war on caterpillars shows how little regard leading Republicans, including Mitt Romney, have for women's health. And yet another incident, Representative Todd Akin, the social conservative seeking to unseat Senator Claire McCaskill in Missouri, found himself at the center of the controversy in August when he told an interview that legitimate rape rarely causes pregnancy, adding that the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down. But it's not just conservatives attacking women in political rhetoric, but also those who are progressive and lean to the left. Democratic operative Hillary Rosen ignited a firestorm on April 11th when she said on CNN that Ann Romney, wife of former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney and President wannabe, had never worked a day in her life. And we still face accepted sexist attitudes and comments every day. Like one reporter did recently when President Barack Obama referred dismissively to her as sweetie. Yet women are not entirely blameless. In an interview on The View, September 25th, 2012, with President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama, Barbara Walters and her colleagues had the perfect opportunity to ask substantive questions about fact and policy. Perfect opportunity. And while they did later on in the show, they began instead to ask benign questions such as, do you wear boxers or briefs? This lost opportunity creates the neo-sexist stereotype that women in political discourse are not competent to ask and tackle the important questions of policy, but must focus rather instead on softer issues. So I ask, are these exceptions and rare occurrences? Unfortunately, no. Going back to the Hillary Clinton and her Kenkel phenomena, and Sarah Palin and her Caribou Barbie persona, sexism in political rhetoric is a historically pervasive issue. But we can and should do something about this, and it begins with us.